Interested in taking a deep dive each week into a compliance or compliance-related topic? Then Compliance Into the Weeds is the podcast for you. Join Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, as they go into the weeds to flesh out a story which you can use to better inform your compliance program. Both you and your compliance program will be the better for listening to this podcast. Compliance Into the Weeds is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
In this episode, Matt Kelly and I take a deep dive into recent comments by two of the five commissioners of the SEC regarding the need for more robust compliance, and also take a look at the former CCO at Apple's alleged attempted bribery in California. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. We have a very special treat for you today, so wait till the end and do not leave in the middle of this podcast. So, Matt, you wrote a really interesting blog post that I thought had a lot of meat and actually lots of issues for the compliance profession, entitled SEC Warning on Insider Stock Sales. Could you tell us about it?
Yeah, Tom. So this was a rather unusual speech effort, I guess. We can call it a charm offensive, maybe, by two top officials at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where the chairman, Jay Clayton, and Bill Hinman, who is the director of the Division of Corporation Finance. So he is not a commissioner, but he is one of the senior-most internal SEC employees who is not a commissioner. But Hinman and Clayton last week both gave separately speeches talking about the same subject, which was how companies should apply internal controls to stock sales that their corporate insiders might be doing. So that would be board directors, CEOs, CFOs, anybody else who would qualify as a corporate insider with a large amount of equity compensation, options, or share grants or something like that. And how they can sell their shares into the market without violating insider trading law. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, but follow along because it's some really interesting stuff that Hinman and Clayton were saying. But traditionally, to absolve yourself or inoculate yourself from any allegations of insider trading trouble, a company would adopt what is known as a 10b5-1 plan. Now, that is a plan where the executive has a set schedule of, we are going to sell this many shares at this price on these dates, once a month, once a quarter, or something like that. But everything is all planned out well in advance of the actual sales. So that includes the share price sale. And then obviously, if you are planning that out in advance, you don't actually know what the stock will be worth on the day of the sale. So these 10b5-1 plans are meant to help inoculate you from any violation of insider trading rules because, hey, I'm an insider, but I planned all this out many, many months before anything came along that would indicate I had some sort of insider knowledge and I was dumping my stock or I was selling it to make a killing or anything like that. So here we have these 10b5 plans. And why is that in the news? Well, specifically, just the other week, the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, he sold $5.5 million worth of Pfizer shares on the same day that Pfizer announced the results of its COVID vaccine, which were wildly successful. And everybody said, oh, well, you know, what is this all about then? Is there something hinky going on? Is this insider trading or whatnot? We should be clear, it's not. He did this according to a 10b5-1 plan, so there is no insider trading shenanigans going on with Bourla's stock sales. But we do have that question, that appearance, the giving the rise to some questions about potential impropriety. And that was what led Hinman and Clayton to talk about how you would have good internal controls around the sale of insider shares. Not Bourla specifically, but this issue of when should you be selling shares? Should you put pause on any of your pre-planned shares? Even if it's according to that 10b5-1 plan, should you maybe pause those sales if material non-public information is suddenly comes to the company's possession? How does all that work? So that's what Hinman and Clayton were talking about. And what makes it interesting is that in October, the SEC actually fined a different company, Tom, one of the energy firms down in Texas. Company's name was Endeavor, which has since sold itself into Marathon Petroleum. But the SEC fined Endeavor $20 million for poor internal controls around its 10b5-1 plans and its CEO's sale of insider stock while the merger talks with Marathon Petroleum were ongoing. And this created some controversy, and what you really don't see and what's newsworthy is that Clayton's fellow Republican commissioners, Hester Pierce and Eli Roisman, they put out their own statements saying, we disagree with this penalty of $20 million because they were using the internal control provisions of the FCPA, which says you must have accurate books and records and all of that fun stuff that we all know. You must have accurate books and records and effective internal accounting controls, and Endeavor did not over its insider stock sales. Except, an insider sale of stock is not part of corporate accounting. And Pierce and Roisman were not wrong to say, why are we doing this? FCPA's internal accounting provisions are supposed to apply to corporate accounting, which is not an insider selling shares that he or she owns. So what are we doing here? They published that statement last week or 2 weeks ago, and then right away, Hinman and Clayton come out with their own speeches a couple of days later, essentially giving the same warnings to companies that, no, really, you do need to have effective internal control over your 10b5-1 plans and insider stock sales. So it was a very odd juxtaposition. You don't usually see Republican commissioners or commissioners of the same political party at odds over an enforcement action. And then comes Hinman and Clayton mounting this charm offensive with different speeches around the country to say that, no, really, you do need this, while other Republicans are saying, no, we shouldn't. And that's a long-winded way of kind of laying the ground. But here we are.
So, Matt, let me pick up on one of the last points around the comments of Hester Pierce and Eli Roisman, because I thought Clayton responded to their criticism quite well, and you quoted it in your blog post, and I want to read it here. A well-designed insider trading program should have controls in place to prevent senior executives and members of the board of directors from trading once a company is in possession of material non-public information, even if that individual officer or director did not personally have knowledge. And that strikes me as a well-thought-out, well-reasoned approach to internal controls around it, but it also not only answers the specific or tactical question raised by Pierce and Roisman, but also, to me, answers or responds to why they are incorrect by asserting that simply because it was, a quote, internal accounting controls. No, it was just internal controls. And they can apply to compliance, they can apply to insider trading, and they can certainly apply to finance and accounting. But if you look at 98% of internal controls, they cover more than simply just accounting or just simply finance. And so it's a firm basis for not only the FCPA violation in terms of ineffective internal controls, but even to me, it points towards the COSO 2013 framework around internal controls, which demonstrated to me that internal controls could be broad enough to handle a variety of legal requirements as well. Well,
yeah, and we're splitting hairs here over the language, but then this is a legal issue, so that's what we do. You're correct that the COSO internal control framework was designed for internal control over any sort of an issue. And that could be financial reporting, anti-bribery. It could be cybersecurity. It could be any number of things. On the other hand, Commissioners Pierce and Roisman are sticklers for, I guess you would say, originalist interpretation of the law. And the law clearly says, and the guidance from the Justice Department, the FCPA Resource Guide says, internal accounting controls, accounting controls. The word is there, right between internal and control. And so their argument is that this is about accounting, and accounting controls are for corporate accounts and financial reporting, not for an executive's sale of shares that he or she owns. I tend to agree that in the best interests of keeping faith and good appearance to the public and investors and employees and others, yes, you should have effective internal controls over your insider stock sales. And if we want to use the FCPA provisions to get that done and use it as an enforcement mechanism, I'm okay with that. Clearly, Pierce and Roisman are not, and Clayton is. And even though Clayton is going to be leaving the commission at the end of the month, we are going to get a Democratic chairman come January 20th when the Biden administration takes over, and we're going to have a Democratic-led commission. So this is not going to go away. What happened with Endeavor and the penalty it got because it had poor internal control over its insider stock sales and its 10b5-1 plans, that's going to keep being a thing. And I was struck that when Hinman and Clayton gave really word for word the same speech about this issue within 2 days of each other to two different audiences, they are saying, folks, this is here to stay. You have to pay attention to this. And I would encourage compliance officers to take Clayton and Hinman at their word.
Matt, there was another part of the Clayton-Hinman dialogue that I found extraordinarily interesting, and it almost broke down into a values-based ethics and compliance program as opposed to a rules-based ethics and compliance program. And I was wondering if you could give a few words about that dichotomy.
Yeah, so this was a point that Hinman raised, which Clayton did not. But when you lay out their speeches or these sections of their speeches next to each other, which I did, they are essentially word for word right up until here. But I don't think Hinman went off the reservation against Clayton's wishes to say this. I'm sure that Clayton would agree with what Hinman said, which was this. There is a common, simple principle at play in these examples. That principle is that companies, management teams, and their boards and advisors are well served when they ask, what should we do, rather than what can we do, as they seek to comply with the federal securities law. Which I think probably gets at what you and I were just talking about with Commissioners Pierce and Roisman, who were basically saying the law lets a company not pay attention to these issues because it says accounting controls. And Hinman is basically saying even if that is the correct interpretation, which he does not believe it is, neither do you, Tom, neither do I, but even if you believe that, there's still the reality that this kind of stinks. And if people, the investors and the general public out there believe that 10b5-1 plans are some way for executives to be too clever by half and still make a killing on insider intel, even though it's not really insider information, like that is a ill-informed perception of what 10b5 plans are. But look, the investors think what they think. So what could you do beyond what the law says to convince investors that you are on the up and up? You could introduce some good practices like what Hinman and Clayton had been saying to make sure that people trust you are acting in an ethical way. Now, how exactly would you do that? I'm not sure. I was really intrigued by that idea that a good, well-controlled 10b5-1 plan would prevent share sales whenever the company has material non-public information, even if the executive doesn't know it, that the information is out there. Well, from a compliance perspective, I'm wondering, how would you catch that? How would you, the compliance officer, know that fresh material non-public information has arrived? How would you intercept the stock sale? How would you make sure your broker-dealer firm running the sale doesn't know that? Like, this seems to me to be a tricky sort of a thing to control, but Hinman and Clayton both gave that as a really good example of this is what they mean. So again, like, folks, they're telling us what they want. Take them at their word for it and read what they said and like figure out how to do it, because Endeavor apparently did not figure it out and they wound up $20 million poorer because of it.
Let me ask you a little bit broader policy question, and it's certainly broader than this specific SEC issue, Matt. We saw the OCC and Fed fine Citigroup and Citibank for basically having ineffective compliance programs, and without pointing to any specific compliance failures. The Endeavor case seemed to me to be, you could argue that it focused on ineffective compliance programs through ineffective internal controls. Could this be maybe a change in how regulators are thinking about compliance programs and that they need to be shown to be effective, or there's a potential for a fine and penalty?
I don't know. I would like to see more enforcement actions along the Endeavor lines before we make a statement like that. I mean, to be clear, I'd prefer that nobody has any enforcement actions because we're all just perfect angels. But anyways, here in the real world, I don't recall seeing an enforcement action like what we saw with Endeavor, where the loosey-goosey approach to who knew what material non-public information during a merger, and then the intersection with the 10b5-1 plan and the stock sales, it was a mess and it resulted in a penalty. Now, I don't know if that is just because that was such an egregious case that it warranted a penalty, or there is some heightened new scrutiny of compliance departments that the SEC is now pushing, and we're going to see more of these in the future. Right now, we only have one point of data to discuss what does this mean, and it's the Endeavor case, and you can't figure out what it means with just one point of data. On the other hand, we have these two speeches where Hinman and Clayton are clearly laying out what they would like to see in the future. I'm hard-pressed to believe any future Democratic SEC chairman or Division of Corporation Finance director are going to say something substantively different or go in a different direction that, no, you don't need to pay attention to insider share sales and 10b5-1 plans. That makes no sense. So I just keep on focusing on look at what they're saying for what they want with an effective internal control over this particular niche of corporate governance, whether that is you, the compliance officer, or the corporate secretary, or the legal department. I don't know who's going to be in charge of it. I would say the compliance officer is probably would do well to know just somebody's going to be in charge of it, and you might want to ask around at your company about who will be in charge of this. If you are sufficiently large, you probably have a lawyer who is dedicated to insider trading issues. If you are not sufficiently large, it's probably whoever looks back at you in the mirror is going to wind up being in charge of this. So everybody listening will have to answer that on their own, but Clayton and Hinman are clearly saying you're going to need to have an answer because we're looking at this. And while it's a moment in time of who's saying it, I don't think the issue is going to go away into 2021 and beyond.
Now, for our listeners, as we promised, we have a story that probably could not happen in any year other than 2020. This is so fantastical, so screwy. You're going to think we made it up, but we didn't. So with that long-winded introduction, Matt, let us have it.
Yeah, so this is breaking news for the Compliance Into the Weeds podcast. This happened about 10 minutes before Tom and I started recording this on Monday afternoon, that a grand jury in Santa Clara County in California indicted one of the top compliance executives at Apple on a bribery charge for apparently, according to the indictment, offering 200 iPads to officers in the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department in exchange for concealed carry permits. I'll give you all a moment to absorb that. But what happened here, the man in question, the Apple executive, is Tom Moyer, who is currently global head of security for Apple. He had been chief compliance officer at Apple from 2009 through 2018. And according to the indictments, two men at the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department were looking to basically shake down local business executives for goodies in exchange for concealed carry permits. And the indictment against Moyer and these other men says that Moyer was looking for 4 concealed carry permits for Apple employees. I presume that these are probably security officers who would have need for weaponry. I don't know all those details. But he was looking for the concealed carry permits. The sheriff's officers demanded a bribe. And the bribe was 200 iPads, which had a value of around $70,000. This all happened apparently sometime in 2019. And at some point, Tom Moyer and the sheriff deputies involved became aware that the district attorney was investigating this matter and had executed a search warrant in relation to the sheriff's office and these potential bribes. So they never actually went through with it, but they were conspiring to do the bribe. That's all from the facts laid out, or the allegations laid out by the Santa Clara County District Attorney and by the indictment that they released on Monday afternoon. Tom, I don't know what else to say about this, because I did not actually ever expect that top compliance executive at largest Apple, or largest electronics manufacturer in the world, would be brought up on a bribery charge, but here we are.
Well, this really is breaking news. There has not been a public comment from Tom Moyer yet, or Apple, although Moyer's attorney, in a statement to Apple Insider, is quoted as saying Tom Moyer is innocent of the charges filed against him. He did nothing wrong and has acted with the highest integrity through his career. We have no doubt that he will be acquitted at trial. The Morgan Hill Times reported that there was a 2-year investigation into corruption and bribery at the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office, and it's ongoing, and more indictments may be issued. So this really is, I don't know if it's 2020. I don't know if when Matt told me this story, I cannot repeat, because it's a PG podcast, what I said, but needless to say, it was about the most shocking thing he could have said to me. And as more, Matt's going to blog about this, and we're going to link hopefully to the indictment. So we'll try to give you the most up-to-date information. But this is certainly, in the Silicon Valley world, has exploded. So all I can say is I'm sure there will be more to come.
All right, Tom, thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. Also, check out the show notes, where I have additional resources available in forms of blog posts written by Matt or myself. I hope you'll join Matt and I again next week, where we take another deep dive, literally going into the compliance weeds. Compliance Into the Weeds is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. We look forward to visiting with you again.